because I think sometimes for parents, they want to run the opposite direction when they hear they need to put boundaries in place.
It feels like other boundaries are easier to implement when it comes to our kids, but for some reason around food, parents are a little bit more skeptical. What then often happens is that translates into them being a little bit more permissive. By putting boundaries in place, we are communicating to our children that we are in control as the parents.
One of the fundamental underlying emotions majority of picky eaters will feel is anxiety.
The core is anxiety, not defiance, necessarily looking for a power struggle. So the one boundary is that this is the meal that you have for dinner and there isn't another meal. They know, well, if I don't eat this, there's going to be a different option. Instead of saying, what would you like with dinner? Because they might give you a whole host of answers. We want to say something like, would you rather have broccoli or carrots, with children feeling empowered, feeling part of the process. But actually on the outside, we are setting the framework by applying these boundaries.
I really do not want your child to starve. So you need to trust me is really for the benefit of your child. Hi everyone, and welcome to Let's Talk Baby. I'm Kath Megaw. I'm a pediatric dietitian, and today I have our other co-host, Dr. Jenny Rose. Last week and the week before, you saw Sammy. She's not with us today, but Jenny's here, and Jenny and I are going to be talking about boundaries. What are normal boundaries? So at the moment in this series, we're really just unpacking what are just normal things, like what is the normal way to learn to eat, like Sammy explained to us. I then looked at what are normal progressions in the food journey. And so we really are hoping that even by listening to these short little podcasts around the normality of eating, you might even realize your child's not as picky as what you actually think they are. And that alone will bring a lot of relief and comfort to you. So thank you, Jenny. I'm so glad you're here with me today. I always love it when my co-hosts are part of this whole journey with us. And I was just thinking when we were talking earlier about the whole boundary thing, it sounds quite daunting when you even mention that word. So firstly, would you just unpack your version and your explanation of a boundary? Because I think sometimes for parents, they want to run the opposite direction when they hear they need to put boundaries in place. And it sometimes sounds quite harsh, especially with this generation who maybe had an experience of some harsh application of boundaries in the past, and especially around eating, because, you know, that we know can cause a lot of trauma. And a lot of the parents I see feel almost traumatized by so-called boundaries put in place around their food. They don't want to repeat that for their child. So maybe just give your definition for us.
Yeah, Kath, I think it's so interesting you touched on that, because it's exactly where I wanted to start. It's just that I think food creates a whole new dynamic when it comes to boundaries. And I think a lot of parents already have their anxiety a little bit elevated or raised when it comes to implementing boundaries around food. It feels like other boundaries are easier to implement when it comes to our kids, but for some reason around food, parents are a little bit more skeptical and a little bit more anxious. And what then often happens is that translates into them being a little bit more permissive and laying back or pulling back on the boundaries, which actually is really not what we're wanting to do and create when it comes to food. And so I think what has happened is that a lot of people, as you've rightly said, have a history of very complex boundary setting with regards to food. And we could probably go so far as to say it was almost more punitive than it was boundaries. And I think that's the sort of misperception or the problem that happens, is that parents think that putting a boundary in place is a punitive thing, and that's actually not what it is. So I think we first need to clarify the difference between being punitive when it comes to food and putting boundaries in place, because one is unhealthy and one is healthy. And so boundaries are just general rule setting and guidelines that we want to adhere to around the food or the eating setup. And I think we need to understand that boundaries are such a critical and important part, because by putting boundaries in place, we are communicating to our children that we are in charge, that we are in control as the parents, and that we have the power and authority in this moment. And those are things we have to have our children understand, because without that, they feel anxious, they feel like there's nobody in control or in charge, and they think they need to step up in those moments. And while children might seem like that's what they want, it's really not good for them, and they don't know what to do with all this control and all this power.
I love that. And I think, like you say, it sometimes seems like that's what they want, but they don't actually have the life skills, the experience, the cognitive readiness to actually step up and take that level of control or understanding how to do it. And creating anxiety. And we know that if you look at the research around picky eating, one of the fundamental underlying emotions majority of picky eaters will feel is anxiety, interestingly enough. It's not just defiance, it's actually anxiety that leads children more into a space of picky eating.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's such a valid point, Kath. Like, I think, that's one of the main goals to me of how we are raising our kids, that we're not creating and inducing anxiety around food. And I think we've really got to take a hard look in the mirror and really reflect a little bit about our own role when it comes to food and how much anxiety we bring to the food setup and the food scenario. A lot of the anxiety is our own anxiety. How perfectly are our children eating? Do they eat the entire meal? What would other people think about the meal that I'm serving my child? We get caught up in our own head and in our own position as the parents that our children feed off of that anxiety, and they associate anxiety and food. And that's when they become defiant or resistant or picky and push the food away. And actually, like you say, at the core is anxiety, not defiance or necessarily looking for a power struggle.
And so Jenny, based on that, what would you say? Ellen Satter has put together like those delegation of responsibility where she talks about, the parent's responsibility is where to feed, what to feed, kind of when to feed, and the child's is then how much they will eat. Maybe just unpack that principle in a practical way for us, because it's a lovely idea, but like, what does that look like in a day for a parent, with regards to food?
Yeah, and I love that analogy. I think it's a very helpful one for parents to think about. I determine what is served, I determine how it is served, and I determine how much I dish onto your plate. But as a child, you then have the control or determine sort of how much of that you are eating. And I think where that overwhelms a lot of parents is they go, but what if my child only eats one bite, and then what? And I think that's where we fall into the unhealthy part of interacting around food, because that's when we start saying, like, you must have a number of bites, or you must finish the food on the plate, or we enter negotiation. If you finish that, you get something else, or use other food, kind of fun foods, as a reward for eating this meal. And I think that's where we get ourselves into a little bit of trouble, and we need to be firmer on those boundaries. So the one boundary is that this is the meal that you have for dinner, and there isn't another meal. Again, a lot of parents have a plan B and a plan C and a plan D. So we'll try the nice, healthy veggie stew, and if you don't eat that, we'll resort to, ham and the safe foods, or the, a piece of chicken that we know that you like. And that's what we want to avoid, because children then also know that. They know, well, if I don't eat this, there's going to be a different option that actually is something I do eat and is something that I like. So I always say to parents, your meal is your meal, and that is what you serve. And then obviously for children, and this is for bigger kids that, nutritionally can kind of get by a little bit better, we want to offer something like an apple or a banana, 15 minutes before bedtime or 20 minutes before bedtime, so that if they are still hungry because they haven't eaten all their meal, there's something that they can sort of snack on. But there are boundaries around that. So they know they have their main meal, and then later they get the option of a banana and an apple. It's not a free for all of any kind of other food. One of the other boundaries we wanting to set and make sure we are encouraging is that our children don't get to determine or dictate what they are then going to eat or other options because they have a massive tantrum or fallout. They don't get to come and cry and scream and say, but I want chips. And then we give into this, because we are the ones that determine, we hold the power and authority. We determine what it is we serve. And our child doesn't get to dictate to us what they want. Again, we always using choices and we are encouraging healthy eating patterns. So it's great to get your kids buy-in. But instead of saying, what would you like with dinner? Because they might give you a whole host of answers. We want to say something like, would you rather have broccoli or carrot as part of your meal tonight?
I like that.
You're putting the boundary in place that it's either about broccoli or carrots. It's a vegetable. But they feel like they've got a little bit of choice and a little bit of freedom in that. So it's really about finding that balance with children feeling empowered, feeling part of the process, but actually on the outside, we are setting the framework by applying these boundaries.
I love that. And I think, I'll just speak to the fear of, like starving, because I think, as a dietitian, I always say to my moms, I really do not want your child to starve. So you need to trust me that putting these sort of boundaries in place is really for the benefit of your child, and missing the odd snack and missing the odd meal because you are enforcing those boundaries is not going to harm a generally well-nourished child. So we will in this series speak to the unwell child and the sick child. And this, we are talking around the healthy child, the child that is healthy on that day, in that moment, doing well. And there's always, variations when they're not well, or children that are not neurotypical, so in development and that. So we're talking about the healthy child, and the healthy child will generally at some point eat sufficiently in order to nourish themselves. And I think it's sometimes trust in that space that is the hard part for a parent. And it's that child that holds out. And in our next conversation, we are going to talk about the different kind of personalities, because I think there are different personalities that we can maybe speak to with regards to how they are going to kind of dig their heels in, and others that are going to be a little bit easier. For today, moms and dads, we hope that just some of these little ideas and thoughts just put your mind at rest with regards to you do hold the power and the importance of you holding the power. It's not because you're a dictator. It's not because you are like, we want you to be like Stalin. It's really because we really know that it will decrease the anxiety in your home and for your child and for you as a parent. So any last comments from you, Jenny?
I just think, Kath, to emphasize that when we don't instill these boundaries, we get into a horrible loop and chain of events where our children learn the pattern of, us not following through with our word, giving them a plan B or a second option meal. And so that pattern just gets perpetuated over and over again. And so like you've said, for this well child that isn't going to starve, there will be this transition period where they might eat less in a meal, or they might skip a meal or skip a snack. But while we hold true to the boundary, they then also learn that this is what the boundary is and are then more likely to actually eat the meal that gets placed in front of them. So you really have to see the long-term gain of this process.
I love that. So moms and dads, consistency, and you can do it. We know you can.